He created an interconnected body of work that looked at history through the funhouse mirror. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Luciano Berio. Luciano Berio was born in October 1925 in northwest Italy, into a musical family. His father and grandfather were both composers. He later said that his hometown's culture only extended to oil and pasta, but his father made sure that music was all around them. Opera was always on the radio, and amateur chamber music performed in the evenings. Lest you think that this was idyllic, far from. At this point, Italy was under the fascist fists, or rather extremely bald head, of Benito Mussolini. Like literally under his head. This was the party HQ. Berio's dad was a real Benito head, who actually dedicated a symphonic poem to the guy. Luciano, who secretly listened to New Orleans jazz records in defiance of the regime, didn't see the appeal. Again, this was the party HQ. It's hard to see why anyone would want to sign up for that, but signing up was not in the cards for young Luciano, who was conscripted at the age of 19 and decided to go along with it. Northern Italy was then under control of Mussolini's so-called Italian Social Republic, little more than a puppet state of the faltering Nazi Germany, and Hitler had Mussolini broken out of prison just to run it, for what happened to be a little over a year and a half. Things weren't being run super efficiently, let's just put it that way. Berio had considered fleeing up into the mountains of Liguria to join the partisans, but feared putting his family at risk. So he decided to show up, and on the first day they gave him a gun, which, I mean, I've never been to basic training, but it seems like a pretty standard thing to do, right? Well, they didn't tell him how to use it, and so he nearly shot his right hand off, and had to recuperate for basically the rest of the war. When he recovered, he forged his discharge papers, and he finally got a chance to go up into the mountains and fight the fascists, but by this point the war was basically over. However, the psychological and physical damage was done. Fascism had, until that moment, deprived me of knowledge of the most essential musical achievements of my own culture. Further, that it was capable of actually falsifying spiritual reality, Berio told the Christian Science Monitor in 1968. The fall after the war ended, having just turned 20, Berio went to study at the conservatory in Milan, where he studied both composition and conducting. He also briefly studied law at the university there, but dropped out after a year. He hadn't composed all that much up until then. There wasn't much time to have done that considering the war, and exposure to contemporary music and its techniques was very limited at best. His primary teacher in Milan was a man named Giorgio Ghidini, whose first love was early music and only really dabbled in modernity. And it wasn't until 1947 that Berio first heard a piece of his, a piano suite, performed in public. He first wanted to be a pianist, but the fact that he almost shot his right hand clean off hindered his ability to play once he recovered. He was never going to be up to concert level, but he was more than competent enough to be an accompanist, which he did for extra money on the side. This ended up affecting his life in a major way, as one day he met the Armenian-American Cathy Berberian, who was looking for an accompanist for a recording session, which would help her Fulbright application. Although they met without knowing a lick of one another's native languages, they married within just a few months of meeting. Cathy got the Fulbright and settled in Milan, but their honeymoon brought Berio, for the first time, to the United States. Berio came out to Tanglewood in the Berkshire Mountains of Massachusetts, which coincided with his turn towards more avant-garde fare. This was the post-war generation. The composers were grappling with new ways of conceptualizing music, as well as new ways of making it. For 6 weeks, he attended lectures given by a fellow Italian, Luigi Della Piccola. Della Piccola was Berio's first major living influence. Here was a serial composer, whose music was also unabashedly lyrical and melodic. Berio loved the United States in comparison to his hometown, but he also wasn't under the whole 12-tone spell for very long. For Berio, the quality of a composer was determined by a single question. Could the composer maintain control of their work? And he didn't feel like he needed serialism in order to maintain that control. Serial composition relies heavily on all sorts of pre-compositional systems, such as organizing tone row forms, and Berio was rarely faithful to the systems he set up when he set up the systems at all. He didn't think Della Piccola was a particularly good teacher, but they bonded over their shared love of literature, especially the work of James Joyce. Berio was an early enthusiast of electronic music, and much as Milton Babbitt was pushing for an electronic studio in the US, Berio pushed for one in Italy, and seemed to have an easier time getting that done. Europe already had a few studios, and Berio was there at the beginning. In 1952, he was in attendance, purely by happenstance, at one of the first public tape music concerts in the United States. The legendary pair of Luning and Ussachevsky premiered their tape piece Sonic Contours at New York's Museum of Modern Art. Berio left thinking that what he'd heard wasn't exactly music per se, but he felt that tape held an extraordinary amount of potential, and he wondered what sounds would be available to him and the next generation of composers by harnessing this technology. Upon his return to Italy, he got to work at inculcating a culture of contemporary music, and especially electronic music. It was in the mid-50s, and he said he felt like he was flying. He was making up for the time that he lost in his provincial upbringing and from his conscription. The Belgian composer Henri Pousseur was also an important teacher in getting Berio up to speed, although sources differ as to whether they met in 1954 or 1956. But in 1955, Berio and fellow composer Bruno Maderna, both early adopters of combining synthesized and processed sounds with live performers, founded the Studio di Fonologia Musicale, and Berio directed it until 1961. The two had met in 1953 and were instant best friends, essentially roommates for the rest of the decade. Maderna was involved in getting the Darmstadt summer school courses up and running. The two wrote scores at breakneck speed to support the fledgling electroacoustic studio, which the RAI, Italy's national broadcaster, did not want to support, although Berio had worked for them for 7 years in the 1950s. Berio and Maderna would also collaborate on a short-lived journal and concert series called Incontri Musicali. But as attractive as electronic music was, Berio was the first to get disillusioned with it. The medium increased the number of available sounds, but it didn't add anything to the concept of music. It was obvious that listeners would not go to a concert just to look at some loudspeakers. Music was, after all, about more than just the sounds themselves. Now, throughout Berio's life and works up to this point, there was this permeation of the human voice. Growing up listening to a lot of opera, marrying one of the best sopranos of his time, and loving Della Piccola's melodic approach to serialism, all of this contributed to Berio's love of the human voice and exploring what it could do. Electronic music was still in its infancy, and tape music had yet to be fully subsumed by electronic synthesis. For Berio, this came to bear in 1958's Thema, Omaggio a Joyce, where he took a recording of his wife saying a passage from James Joyce's Ulysses, and then just, deep fried it, basically, totally altering, mangling intelligibility, and he blurred the line between poetry and music. Berio did this a lot. He was all about exploring the ways in which the human voice could be treated as though it were an acoustic instrument, and the ways in which one can blur and elide meaning through either electronic or, later, acoustic ends. While Berio spent a good deal of time in his native Italy in an attempt to jumpstart a culture of contemporary music there, the 1960s were also Berio's American period in a way. He spent time teaching at Tanglewood as well as universities on both coasts. It was during this decade that Berio really came into his own as a composer. His style matured and he wrote the pieces that would establish his name in music history forever. Chief among these is his most famous piece, 1968's Sinfonia, a manic whirlwind postmodernist deconstruction of the symphony, music history, and the meaning of art itself. It's in the running for the best piece of the century, no joke. Repeated listenings are a must. The piece is practically inexhaustible with how much you see and hear every time you try to come to grips with it.
Well, so there is an audience. It's a public show. You buy your seat and you wait. Perhaps it's free show. You take your seat and you wait for it to begin. Or perhaps it's compulsory, a compulsory show.
But the Sinfonia was part of a larger trend. Berio was always about focusing on the next piece as soon as he'd finished up with the current one. And he was in a place where his pieces would have these kind of vague, like really broad abstract titles. The year after Sinfonia, which just means symphony, he wrote an opera called Opera. Way to go there on the originality, dude. What spurred on major pieces like this was the culmination of a process of continual dissatisfaction. For him, serialism was this kind of crystallized navel-gazing at its best, and a fetish that reminded him of fascism at its worst. The electronic world, as interesting as it was, didn't do much beyond introducing the possibility of new sounds. And as Babbitt was fond of pointing out, nothing in music got old faster than just a new sound. And Berio agreed. He fell back on a technique usually associated with the American avant-garde at the same time, that of indeterminacy. The composer giving up choices within certain parameters here or there. This was something Berio could get into. He could adapt it. Not going full John Cage, mind you, but working in this manner led Berio to ever closer relationships to individual performers. Barring a conductor willing to lavish an absurd amount of rehearsal time on a single piece, Berio's efforts in these collaborations would result in a series of solo pieces called the Sequenzas series, which we'll talk about in just a few more minutes.
Where you don't know what, for a hand to come and draw you away, somewhere else, where perhaps it's worse.
Speaking on a broader level about Berio's approach to music, he adopted a neo-Ivesian approach to composition, where the concept of the work meant something, even if he wouldn't be inclined to use that term. While Ives meant this in the sense that he never played the same thing twice and struggled with how to notate that, for Berio, it meant constructing a network of connected, interrelated pieces of music. One series of works would generate spin-offs, which could then cross over and cross-pollinate. It was, for lack of a better term, the Luciano Berio cinematic universe. The Sequenzas series, all for solo instruments, rendered another series of pieces called Chemin, or Paths. Sequenza 6 for viola spun off Chemin 2 and 3, differing in the size of the ensemble that Berio built to accompany the original Sequenza material. This also spun off Chemin 2B and 2C, which play with the centrality of the viola. One removes the viola entirely, just leaves the accompaniment, and the other one substitutes a bass clarinet for the viola. And this kind of thing went back into other composers' music as well, his willingness to quote and grab and just distort anything he could get his hands on. The central movement of the Sinfonia is woven around the scherzo from Mahler's Second Symphony. The best way to analyze and comment on a piece, Berio said, is to do something using materials from that piece. So when he quotes or riffs on the music of Mahler or Bach or Beethoven or Schubert or anybody else, he is analyzing that music. He's asking what that piece truly means. Sinfonia also breaks the boundaries between performers and audience members. The singers and conductor are introduced and thanked by name during the course of the movement. Berio took an idiosyncratic approach to the toolbox of musical techniques. His study of serial technique led him to frequently use all 12 tones over the course of a piece in some structural way, but that's where the influence ends. A piece of structure may be informed by taking the whole chromatic set and then freezing each note in a certain register. But techniques like this exist alongside techniques from earlier eras. This is why I think of Berio as an essentially postmodern composer, in the sense that his music is a break from the modernist ethos of his era. In music, at least, modernism is associated with an intense understanding a heightened self-awareness of one's place within the arrow of historical progression. This is why a composer like Schoenberg can be a modernist composer, because he wrote music believing that his music was the next step in an inevitable, inexorable progression of Western music, and specifically Germanic music. It's not so much the music itself, it's the idea behind it that classifies something as either postmodern or just modern. Postmodernism is more of a time's a flat circle, everything can exist all at once mentality. Postmodernism questions any supposed arc or narrative to human history, and is best understood as a patchwork of resistance to the ideas of modernism. There's not just one postmodernism, it's more like postmodern isms. History, Berio said, is not a linear process. I don't believe things happen in a deterministic way, where there's a cause and there's an effect. This echoes postmodern ideas, and sometimes you're going to hear Berio referred to as a modernist composer just for the era he was in. I just don't think that's true. Not if you compare what he said and what he thought to the general ideas of postmodernism, and how that manifested in music. You can find relentless focus on single pitches or simple processes, living alongside avant-garde soundscapes or isorhythmic techniques straight from late medieval times. In the Sinfonia, sources for text include Samuel Beckett, James Joyce, Berio and his friends, Harvard undergrads, Martin Luther King Jr.'s name, solfege syllables, and graffiti from the 1968 Sorbonne riots, as though the past 3 or so decades had just collapsed in on themselves. It went beyond just quotation, it was a transformative collage. The third movement, Berio said, was not so much composed as assembled for the sake of a mutual transformation. The Mahler analogous to a river running through the landscape. Music for Berio was so intrinsically tied to history that one could not just start from square one. So why wouldn't you choose, in that sense, to use everything that was already available to you? Berio also objected to the term avant-garde. He thought it was overused, especially in the United States. He didn't like being lumped in with people who were more radical than he was, composers like Moderna or Luigi Nono. He was only avant-garde, he said, in that his work contained a thread of experimentalism. But true to postmodernism, he said that all ways of making, listening to, and even talking about music are right in their way. Some just didn't know what to make of how this was made manifest in his music. In his piece Visage from the early 1960s, Berio asked Berberian to perform a series of improvised monologues, guided by the phonemes or gestures of one or another language, and then he processed these electronically into a 20-minute piece, only to have his old employer, RAI, ban it from the airwaves for obscenity, even though it only contained one actual word. Okay. Alright, I can see where they're coming from here. It's a little uncomfortable. Berio's hatred of the Mussolini regime was never far from his music. It's only when you adopt political criteria and try to view musical experiences as an expression of class relations, he said, that you can't avoid moral judgments, and they will of necessity come down heavily on a society that encourages people to listen to melodies and nothing else. This highly charged political environment of his youth informed how he dealt with the major divide in contemporary music in the late 50s, represented by the total control of Pierre Boulez on one hand and the complete open chance of John Cage on the other. Berio was friendly with both sides, but never quite took a side in the debate. Serialism was too restrictive. Silent music was, and I quote, thoroughly stupid. Chance techniques, simply a deception. And the whole idea of experimental music was a false distinction. Berio pointed out that, after all, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony was an experimental work. The reason that we know it today is because the experiment was such a success. So he found a third path, the idea of the open work, borrowed from his friend, the polymath Umberto Eco. This approach split the difference. It required performers to navigate a network of possible, in this case, musical relationships. There are many ways to do this. Stockhausen was also interested in this sort of thing, and his Klavierstück 11 is a prime example, with meticulous bits of composed out music all over the page, through which the performer must navigate. Stuff like this combined elements of Boulez-like control with Cage-inspired openness. And an affinity for Joyce makes a lot more sense in this frame. Finnegan's Wake is an apt literary analog for what Berio was trying to do in his music. And he was also willing to engage in techniques that made his music more understandable to listeners, such as the use of repetition in pieces like 1960's Circles, a setting of E. E. Cummings' poetry in a clearly palindromic A-B-C-B-A form, where musicians' placement on stage is important. Even outside of his operatic works, Berio often specified a kind of choreography to his performers, or made precise, unusual seating arrangements for his orchestras.
Ding.
Relevant to a postmodern reading of Berio is his intense love of folk music, but not just that of his native region. Several generations before Berio, composers had field days exploring their cultures and then infusing their respective native sounds into their works. But for Berio, his interest in folk music was part of a wider interest in folklore itself, and a search for unity underlying musical worlds that are apparently alien to one another. This relates to Berio's idea that his music was about moving things into and out of focus, comparing the process to a person who is in a comfort zone, then goes outside of their comfort zone, grows, and then returns to their comfort zone, their group, having grown as a person, and then furthering the group as well. This makes his concerto works especially interesting, because you do have that soloist group dynamic. And in his concerto for two pianos and orchestra, the soloist's central roles are blurred, and occasionally they accompany members of the orchestra. In 1962, Berio wrote Passaggio, a work that he emphatically refused to say was an opera, but yet required performance on an operatic stage. This piece was composed based on something of a gambit. If you wrote something so eminently crazy that you could guarantee the audience would make a racket and jeer and boo and cause a fuss, you could then use that as part of the piece itself. So the vocal forces for Passaggio include a solo soprano protagonist and two choirs, one of which is dispersed among the audience. As soon as someone started shouting "Buffoni," the choir dispersed in the audience improvised on that. For Paul Griffiths, Passaggio highlights an indeterminacy of meaning, which prized ambiguity of language and a resistance to offer the last word on anything. Berio further explored this eclectic range in Labyrinthus II, an appropriately named labyrinth of a piece, halfway between music and poetry, between opera and concert work. Before we go any further, I'd like to thank the sponsor of this video, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online community featuring thousands of inspiring classes for anyone who loves being creative and learning new skills. It's the perfect place to start if there's a new skill you want to learn in any creative field. Photography, graphic design, illustration, web development, you name it. And new premium classes drop on Skillshare every week, so there's always something new to discover. A class I've enjoyed recently is The Beginner's Guide to PHP Mastery by John Morris. That might sound a little strange because my online presence revolves so entirely around music, but I've actually loved coding websites by hand since I was about 10, in case you've ever doubted my nerd credentials. PHP always sort of scared me for some reason, and plus I really never had all that much use for it. But this class has been a great introduction, and I like how he talks about coding as a medium of creativity, which I've even done in some of my pieces. Although this is decidedly not PHP. But now that my career has grown, I'll almost certainly end up using PHP in the future. The first 1,000 people to use the link in the description below will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so you too can have the opportunity to fuel your curiosity and explore your creativity. Thanks again to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and now to talk about Berio's best-known series, the Sequenzas. Now on to Berio's most famous series, the Sequenzas. Each sequenza was tailored to the capabilities of specific instruments, and in many cases, the abilities of specific players. They're not exactly your standard virtuoso pieces. Yes, they're hard. Yes, they sound like they're hard a lot of the time, but Berio wasn't after pieces that just glorified a performer's ability to execute something technical fast. Instead, Berio expanded performance techniques into new directions. For instance, the violin sequenza opens with triple stops on a unison. Nobody bothered asking a violinist to do that before old Luciano did. Oboist composer Heinz Holliger, speaking both of Sequenza 7 and of the series more broadly, wrote that Berio proposed to treat technical problems together with compositional problems, to show that the expansion of instrumental technique is a result not of soloistic exhibitionism, but of logical musical thought. Since many sequenzas were written for monophonic instruments, he wanted to suggest a polyphonic mode of listening. This was a link between the Baroque practice of leaping between registers to imitate counterpoint, if you could only play one note at a time, and the more modern practice of eliciting multiphonics from wind instruments, where two or more notes quite literally sound at the same time. Berio said that the title of sequenza, or sequence, came from how they are unified by a sequence of what he liked to call harmonic fields, which often, because again these are solo pieces, are often just single notes that serve as anchoring points for this or that section of the music. He pushed the limits of an instrument, but he did not use it, in his own words, against its own nature. The Sequenza series would have made Bob Ross proud. It was a happy little accident. In 1957, flutist Severino Gazzelloni, a friend from their overlapping time at Darmstadt, commissioned a small flute concerto, and Berio wrote the first sequenza for solo flute a year later, dedicating it to Gazzelloni as a show of thanks. Berio was then commissioned for a harp concerto just 4 years later, and in order to get the hang of a notoriously fickle instrument, Berio wrote a short test piece, and it bore a striking resemblance to the sequenza, and so he called it Sequenza 2. 3 more came along in 1966, and from there it was pretty clear that Berio would continue to write these pieces for the rest of his career. He never repeated an instrument in the series, and they are so specifically tailored for the instrument that they are written for that transcriptions are very rare. The 9th sequenza for clarinet exists as Sequenza 9b for a saxophone version, but you can't easily adapt others. Some, like the 9th for guitar, is so intimately tied into the instrument's tuning, it has a section for checking the tuning and fixing it if necessary. You just can't adapt it for any other instrument and have it be the same piece. Although I would give a lot of money, like $15, to have a sequenza for banjo. Alas, the strangest one we got was for accordion. He only composed an official 14 numbered sequenzas, but that was more than enough to cement its place in music history as a definitive collection of solo pieces in such a series, stretching from 1958 until 2002. The unity of the Sequenza series isn't on a gestural basis. It's not like one piece sounds particularly like another in a kind of nuts and bolts way. Rather, as I was reading the analytical literature on the series, scholars tend to point out that what Berio said about one sequenza is pretty true for the whole series, and often as well for pieces outside of the series. One of these ideas is a level of tension across several dimensions. You can have high, medium, and low tension in the temporal, dynamic, pitch, and morphological dimensions. Tension in that lattermost requires a little bit of explanation. On a flute, this would be making the flute sound like not a flute, would be a high level of morphological tension. If a flute sounds more like a flute, there would be low morphological tension. Berio could then chart levels of tension that would change across these dimensions to create a polyphony of structure across an entire piece. Berio wanted this series to embody virtuosity. So you have to ask the question, what does virtuosity mean in this case? And for him, it was the conflict between two competing elements of a work of art, such as a musical idea that's difficult to make of an instrument, or music that problematizes a performer's relationship to their instrument, which is all fairly standard fare. But this is where it gets interesting. Berio said that the virtuosi he wrote for had to be able to perform within a broad historical perspective. Much as matter cannot be created or destroyed in the world of physics, a musical instrument is in itself a piece of musical language. To try and invent a new one would be as futile and pathetic as trying to invent a new grammatical rule for our language. Preparing a piano in the John Cage style was like drawing a mustache on the Mona Lisa. Berio also didn't like synthesizers, because in his view they tried to do all things for all people, and they restricted composers' ability to think musically. Strange coming from a guy who did electronic music, but his electronic music was like old school, let's record something and then futz around with the tape sort of thing. Thus were the ground rules for the Sequenzas series set, which excluded the changing or altering of instruments in any way. So in his 7th sequenza for oboe, a repeated B in the middle of the staff is repeated at great length, and Berio asks the oboist to play the note using one of any of 5 different fingerings. The only way Berio, not an oboist, would settle on this B would be if he had asked an oboist, hey, what note allows for the most alternative fingerings? The answer is that very B, of which there are about 100 potential fingerings. Now most of these 100 different fingerings are going to be audibly indistinguishable from one another. So Berio asks his oboist to select 5 different fingerings that are noticeably different in tone color. He'd been interested in this since his first Della Piccola-inspired works. A movement of his Joyce settings, called chamber music, is called monotone, and just relentlessly explores a particular A. There are some exceptions and oddballs within the Sequenza series for sure. In his 5th, from 1966, he calls for the trombonist to be in white tie and tails and illuminated with a spotlight. An odd theatricality even for a sequenza, and pulled, like Sequenza 3, from his childhood memories of a multi-instrumentalist best known as Grock the Clown, a childhood neighbor of Berio's from whose yard he and his schoolmates often stole fruit. Sequenza 5 is also notable for Berio's choice of swapping out dynamic markings for numbers between 1 and 7, a practice adopted, it appears, because Berio felt like he needed to establish 1 as the softest possible sound a performer could make, and 7 as the loudest possible sound a performer could make, with specific gradations in between. It all depends on what a performer can do. I suppose that he thought just using these standard dynamic markings would be too confusing, that a fortissimo for one player would not be another player's fortissimo. But no piece is more built for a single performer than Sequenza 3, a solo soprano work written for Cathy Berberian, who was still collaborating with Berio even though by now they were separated. Sources differ as to whether this marriage ended in 1964 or 1966. My money's on 64. This is the date that Berio scholar David Osmond-Smith gives. 1966 was the year of his second marriage to Susan Oyama, then a psychology student at Harvard. In any event, the soprano sequenza is tailored to the instrument that he knew better than anyone else's. Post-divorce, Berberian retained her title as one of the world's leading sopranos, even after she took a 5-year break in the 1950s to raise their daughter Christina. She was still Berio's muse. Berberian said that Sequenza 3 was an X-ray of a woman's inner life. It's not only written for Cathy, Berio said, it's about Cathy. Berio was very old school when it came to how one should teach composition. And when I say old school, I mean like old world, learn your trade apprenticeship style. It was not uncommon for European composers to teach their grad equivalent students by having them work on their compositions, such as orchestrating them. Berio took this a step further. In many cases, his students wrote the music outright. Under specific direction, of course. Berio would say what he wanted, but he left much for the students to fill in. Then he'd come along later and he would correct it. It's kind of hard to believe that this was his way of composing, but I've heard this from 3 different musicians who knew or worked with him in some capacity, and they all independently told me this over the course of several years, so I don't think it's some collusion to like get false information into a YouTube video. In one case, it actually led to a double bass part in which it's actually physically impossible to play. The double stop just can't be performed. and his anonymous student didn't know better, and Berio didn't catch it in revision. With this as his composition method, farming out a decent chunk of not just the grunt work, but some of the creativity as well, it may come as a shock to you that Berio was never on time delivering his pieces to performers. In this matter, he's hardly alone, but if your working method was like his, I don't think you really have an excuse. Berio relied on others to help him produce his music because he was in very high demand. Prizes piled up, even including honorary doctorates, which, and I've covered a lot of these composers, that doesn't happen that often. For Paul Griffiths, this public adoration was likely due to how his approach towards composition was not as off-puttingly dogmatic as some of his contemporaries. He always focused on manipulating recognizable elements in his music and was unafraid of referencing the past or the present. In this sense, the relatively large public affection afforded him was similar to how the American minimalists, the Philip Glasses of the world, won over audiences by offering understandable music. Berio's work is decidedly avant-garde. I don't care what he said about it, but it's also the most accessible music of practically anyone in that camp. Humor is also a crucial element in his work, because he's willing to be funny, and not always super profound all of the time, which is a refreshing honesty in comparison to some of his contemporaries. His contemporaries wouldn't have been caught dead working so openly and closely with folk music, but Berio was. Long story short, he was refreshingly anti-dogmatic in an era where there were a lot of very rigid ideologies. He'd also go out of his way to help others. When the violist Aldo Benici was going through a messy and expensive divorce, Berio wrote him the theatrical Naturale, and the piece was so popular that within 6 months of playing it, Benici had paid off his debts. Berio taught at Juilliard between 1965 and 1972. He also taught at Harvard for the first year, but he found the commute quite impossible to deal with. At Juilliard, he founded the Juilliard Ensemble, dedicated to contemporary music, but he quit because he couldn't keep up with his twice-a-week schedule. Of the lessons he was obliged to give out on the half hour, Berio remarked that he'd been turned into a dentist, and in 1972 returned to Italy, and he stayed there on a more full-time basis. By 1975, he had refurbished a Tuscan farmhouse and had moved in. From then on, Berio was based firmly in Italy. He had spent a good deal of time in the United States and had held a mixed view of the country's musical life when it was all said and done. On the one hand, he applauded the number of orchestras there were and the musicians' pay, and he certainly got a lot of opportunities to teach as well. On the other hand, he understood that market pressures forced composers to keep doing the very thing that got them fame in the first place. His best example being the slow, quietly evolving work of Morton Feldman. In Berio's mind, Feldman was forced to do the slow, quiet stuff because it's what got him famous. That's a bit of a distortion of the timeline, but he's also not entirely wrong. 1976 stood for Berio as a significant step forward. He wrote a 31-movement piece called Coro, which combined Central African heterophony with folk idioms from Yugoslavia and the poetry of Pablo Neruda, and used 5 different languages along the way, requiring a highly unusual orchestral seating that places singers and instrumentalists in different groups. It was a response to a heightened level of political violence that had gripped Italy at the time, and Berio's high degree of social engagement led to this as his response. Much as the French riots of the late 1960s had made their way into Sinfonia, so too did similar, longer-lasting social upheaval during the so-called Years of Lead in Italy lead to the composition of Coro. Berio looked at what the totality of a piece was. He wasn't trying to trace some arrow of time through it. He likened this process to subtracting from something larger. Beethoven's scholarship, for instance, could not escape from what Berio thought was a deeply serialist tendency to think that Beethoven's music is always aiming someplace, like it's a train on a train track and things are just inevitable. Berio pointed out that Beethoven's sketches hardly ever suggest a linear working order. The music exists in some sense out of time. We're just forced to perceive it in time. Berio's music defies the idea of different periods that musicologists seem to love so much and seem so dead set on cramming different composers into. Berio's work is eclectic and harder to pigeonhole in that way. He spoke of music as a fairy tale, where one model of behavior gradually transforms into another. His earlier folk song arrangements, spurred on in part by the heritage of Cathy Berberian, continued into Voci, a 1984 concerto for viola and 2 orchestras, based on Sicilian folk music. And as always, Berio's creation of a network of music Minty also composed the aforementioned Naturale on the same Sicilian source set. In Naturale, Berio includes a tape part, by that point a newfangled CD track, of genuine Sicilian street vendor songs sung by the Palermitano Peppino Celano and recorded by Berio himself almost 2 decades earlier during the composition of Sinfonia. So throughout his career, Berio found stylistic mashups, musical fusion cuisine that served the interests of whatever piece he was working on. It was a utopian dream, in his words, to unify the Western classical tradition with folk music. He understood that it wasn't quite possible to do, but it didn't mean that his efforts were in vain. One last related concept in this video's veritable ocean of them is that of transcription. Some composers work by composing solely in their heads, and entirely in abstract sounds. Then the notation process comes fairly late. It's not just writing down what's in their heads, but transcribing music from one abstract medium into something concrete and replicable. This distinction between music in the abstract, in one's head or in the air, and music on the page was, for Berio, ripe for exploration. He identified with an earlier Italian composer-pianist, Ferruccio Busoni, who believed that the transcriber had an active role to play in transcription. Much like a translator always has to make decisions on how to communicate complicated ideas or deal with language-specific idioms, so too must the musical transcriber. For a composer like Berio, who borrowed and adapted other composers' music as fluently and naturally as his own previous pieces, the Busoni concept was central to his own music. When Berio dealt with folk music or anything from the vernacular, it's rarely a verbatim quote. Instead, it's a process of transformation, of transcription, as he interprets one thing into a new context. In fact, the very act of setting a text to music itself was an act of transcription. The creative process, too, nothing but transcription. From idea to sketch to first draft to finished product, composers often reworked and reinterpret their work to arrive at some kind of definitive piece. But for Berio, each step was a new transcription. There was no definitive version of the work. Older pieces played on modern instruments with larger ensembles were transcriptions. If Beethoven's symphonies were performed on orchestras 2 or 3 times the number of musicians as their premieres, also transcription. All music carried reverberations of the past, and all music carried with it implications for the future. And few things bothered Berio more than performers who said they specialized in contemporary music. He didn't quite understand what that was supposed to mean. Berio kept at the idea of transcription for the rest of his life. In addition to the pieces already mentioned, the folk songs and voci, the piece Rendering deserves special mention. In the late 1980s, Berio took some unfinished symphonic sketches of Franz Schubert and created a piece out of them, adding only a celeste to an orchestra of otherwise perfectly classical proportions. To 1977, Berio said, were years he spent in hotels due to his side career as a conductor. But Berio had no desire to live that sort of dual life. Conducting sapped creative time from a whole host of composers, and Berio didn't want to do that to himself. From then on, he said that he turned down more opportunities than he took on. He preferred to conduct his own works, and said he didn't actually like the performance part of the process. For him, the best part of being in front of an orchestra was the rehearsing. Overlapping this era, from 1974 until 1980, he accepted a position at ERCAM. Boulez himself reached out to ask Berio if he would like to run their electroacoustic research. 1977 was also the year in which Berio married his third and final wife, Talia Pecker, 6 years after his divorce from Susan Oyama. Berio, it seemed, wanted to leave more of a legacy than the few students he taught relative to the composers who spent their whole lives in the Academy. In 1987, Berio founded a new music institute in Florence called Tempo Reale. Berio had mixed feelings about ERCAM and how it was run. Tempo Reale was, in part, Berio's answer to how a musical research center should be run. This institute carried on research from his Urcam years, and in 1989 they produced TRAILS, an acronym for Tempo Reale Audio Interactive Location System, which could read a score and then send audio around a hall to various speakers in what its creators called an interactive system for sound location. Berio directed Tempo Reale until 2000, when he became the artistic director of the National Academy of Santa Cecilia, a legendary institution founded in 1585. Although for the last couple of decades of his life, his musical career became more and more focused on Europe and Italy specifically, this is not to say that he shunned the outside world entirely. In fall 1993, he once again took up residence at Harvard as the Charles Eliot Norton Chair, and there delivered his edition of the famous Norton Lectures. His set of 6 was appropriately entitled Remembering the Future. A somewhat reduced and geographically focused schedule allowed Berio to take on more projects, including 3 operas from 1981 to 1999. Since the disastrous premiere of his multi-layered opera called Opera, Berio had written a number, but this is where his complicated ideas were just too clever for their own good, so to speak. In opera, the narrative is supposed to work on multiple levels and shift between several allegorical tales. It requires not only virtuoso performers, but a virtuoso director and virtuoso audience as well. Luciano Berio died in May 2003 at the age of 77, having placed an indelible mark on the 20th century. His eclectic approach to composition, spurning the trends of modernism in favor of a much freer form of expression, created some of the most interconnected music ever written. His work with individual performers in the Sequenzas series, which took most of his life, assured his legacy in chamber music, and his Sinfonia, as many forces as it requires, has found a place in the repertoire because of how endlessly fascinating it is. A collage, as much as he didn't like the term, of past and present, looking forward to the future. He was an outsider in many ways. Not self-taught, not operating outside social norms, as that term usually implies, but the fact that there was nobody else doing what he did. No one else was operating in an ideology where everything was connected, where humor could come from anywhere, and anything could coexist with anything else at any time for any reason. When the musical world was torn between the polar opposites of Boulez and Cage, on 2 ends of a spectrum, it was only Berio who breached that chasm as his third path. And like a true outsider, no one school of thought sprang up after him. Like the layers of his music, what he did diffused back into the zeitgeist, and has laid the groundwork for many contemporary composers to be unafraid of labels, to be inspired by as many sources as possible, and above all, not to take it all too seriously.